Hi, I'm Sarah Mitchell. 6 months ago, I buried the man I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. David and I had been married for 23 years, and I believed we had no secrets between us. We shared everything from morning, coffee conversations to late-night dreams about retirement. But when I found a sealed envelope hidden behind our wedding photo with my name written in his familiar handwriting, everything I thought I knew about our life together crumbled in an instant. Inside that envelope was a letter that revealed David had been living a double life for our entire marriage. He had a son I never knew existed. A 25-year-old man he'd been secretly supporting, loving, and watching grow up from a distance while sitting across from me at dinner every single night. The letter didn't just contain words of confession. It held DNA test results, years of hidden bank statements, and photographs of birthdays, graduations, and milestones that belonged to a family I never knew we had. Would you open that letter? If you knew it would shatter every memory you held sacred? If you knew it would force you to question whether the love you thought was real was built on a foundation of lies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I found David's letter started like any other Tuesday in my new reality as a widow. I woke up in our king-sized bed, still reaching for his side out of habit, only to feel the cool emptiness that had become my constant companion. The October air in Cedar Falls carried that crisp bite that David always loved, the kind that made him want to rake leaves just so he could jump in the pile afterward like a kid. I'd been dreading this day for weeks because it was the day I'd finally promised myself I would start going through his personal belongings. Rebecca Chen, my best friend since college, had been gently pushing me toward this moment since the funeral. She'd bring it up carefully during our weekly coffee dates at Miller's, always couched in supportive language about healing and moving forward. But I knew she was right. The closet still smelled like his cologne. His reading glasses were still, folded on the nightstand next to a half-finished mystery novel, and his coffee mug remained in the same spot in the dishwasher where I'd placed it the morning he had his heart attack. I started with the easy things. His clothing went into neat piles for donation, keeping only his favorite flannel shirt and the sweater I'd given him for our 20th anniversary. His books were sorted between ones I wanted to keep and ones for the library's annual sale. But when I reached the top shelf of our bedroom closet, my fingers touched something unexpected wedged behind our framed wedding portrait from 1999. It was a manila envelope, thick and substantial, with "For Sarah" written across the front in David's careful script. But this wasn't the David's handwriting I was used to seeing on grocery lists and birthday cards. This was deliberate, heavy, the kind of writing you do when every letter matters. The envelope had been sealed and then reinforced with tape, as if he'd wanted to make sure it would never accidentally come open. I sat on the edge of our bed holding that envelope for nearly 20 minutes. Part of me wanted to put it back where I'd found it and pretend I'd never discovered it. David had been gone for 6 months, and I was finally starting to sleep through the night again. I was beginning to remember him with smiles instead of tears. Whatever was in this envelope had been hidden for a reason, and maybe that reason died with him. But I've never been the kind of woman who could leave mysteries unsolved. David used to tease me about how I'd read the last page of novels when I was only halfway through because I couldn't stand not knowing how things ended. So I carefully peeled back the tape and slid my finger under the envelope's seal. The first thing I pulled out was a handwritten letter, 4 pages long on David's professional letterhead from his accounting firm. The date at the top made my breath catch. It was written just 2 weeks before he died, which meant he'd been planning to tell me something and had run out of time. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to tell you the truth while I was alive. And for that, I am more sorry than you will ever know." My hands started trembling before I reached the end of the first paragraph. David wrote that he had been carrying a secret for our entire marriage, one that had shaped every financial decision we'd made. every vacation we'd planned, and every conversation we'd had about our future. He had a son named Michael Torres, born 3 months before we started dating, and he had been supporting him financially and emotionally from the shadows for 25 years. I had to stop reading and walk to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. The woman staring back at me in the mirror looked like someone I didn't recognize. Her eyes were wide with shock, her skin pale as paper. This was the same mirror where David used to stand behind me in the mornings, kissing my neck while I put on earrings. How many times had he looked at our reflection knowing he was living a lie? When I returned to the letter, David explained that during his senior year of college, he'd had a brief relationship with Maria Torres, an exchange student from Guatemala who was studying education. They dated for only 4 months, but when she told him she was pregnant, he'd promised to support her and the baby, even though they'd decided not to marry. Maria had wanted to raise the child as a single mother, planning to return to Guatemala after graduation, but David had insisted on providing financial help. The timing was what made this revelation so devastating. David and I had met just 3 months after Michael was born, at a coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my teaching degree. He'd told me about Maria, describing her as an ex-girlfriend he'd cared about deeply, but he'd never mentioned a child. When I fell in love with David, I thought I was getting a fresh start with someone who had a clean slate, just like I did. According to the letter, David had planned to tell me about Michael before we got married, but Maria had asked him to keep the secret. She was worried that involving another woman in Michael's life might complicate things, especially since she'd decided to stay in the United States and build a life in Portland, just 2 hours away from Cedar Falls. David had agreed to her request, thinking he could manage both relationships separately without anyone getting hurt. But as I continued reading, I realized the scope of what David had been hiding from me. He hadn't just been sending monthly child support payments, which would have been understandable and something we could have worked through. He had been actively involved in Michael's life, attending school events when he could, sending birthday gifts, and even meeting with him regularly as he grew older. The envelope contained evidence I never could have imagined. There were copies of bank statements showing monthly transfers of $600 to an account in Maria's name, starting from before our wedding and continuing until the month David died. There were photographs tucked into a separate folder. Michael as a toddler taking his first steps, Michael starting kindergarten with a backpack that looked expensive, Michael playing Little League Baseball in a uniform David had apparently paid for. The pictures progressed through the years like a parallel family album I'd never seen. Michael graduating from high school in a cap and gown, standing next to a woman who must have been Maria, both of them smiling broadly. Michael starting college at Oregon State University, wearing a sweatshirt I now realized David had bought during one of his business trips to Corvallis. There was even a photo of Michael at what appeared to be his 21st birthday party, and in the background, partially obscured by other guests, I could make out David's familiar profile. 21 years old. That meant David had been at Michael's birthday party just 4 years ago, around the same time he'd told me he was attending a boring accounting conference in Portland. I remembered that weekend clearly because I'd been disappointed that he'd had to work instead of spending our anniversary together. Now I knew he'd been celebrating his son's milestone birthday while I'd spent the evening alone, watching old movies and eating takeout Chinese food. The final item in the envelope was the most devastating of all, a DNA test result dated just 6 months before David's death. The document confirmed with 99.7% certainty that David Mitchell was the biological father of Michael Roberto Torres. At the bottom of the page, David had handwritten a note. "I always believed he was mine, but I needed to be certain before I told you the truth. I was planning to introduce you to him this Christmas." I sank onto our bedroom floor, surrounded by 25 years of evidence that my marriage had been built on a fundamental deception. David hadn't just made one mistake and hidden it. He had been actively maintaining a second family while creating a life with me. Every time he'd said he was working late, every business trip that had seemed unnecessary, Every time he'd been vague about his weekend plans, he'd potentially been with Michael and Maria. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cruelest part wasn't just the deception itself. It was realizing how many conversations we'd had about children that had been lies by omission. When we'd struggled with infertility in our early 30s, David had been the one to suggest we stop trying and focus on our careers instead. He'd held me while I cried about never being a mother, telling me that we had each other and that was enough. But he'd already been a father for nearly a decade by then. When my younger sister Jennifer had her first baby, and I'd mentioned feeling a little envious of her maternal joy, David had been quick to remind me about all the freedom we had as a childless couple. We could travel whenever we wanted, he'd said. We could spend our money on ourselves. We didn't have to worry about college tuition or teenage drama. All the while, he'd been paying for Michael's education and attending his baseball games. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting on our bedroom floor, going through every photograph and document multiple times, looking for clues I should have noticed. There were subtle signs I'd missed or explained away. David's reluctance to vacation in certain parts of Oregon, always suggesting we go to the coast instead of inland areas where I now suspected Michael had been living. His habit of checking his phone at odd hours and stepping away to take calls he'd described as work-related. The way he'd sometimes seemed distracted during conversations, especially around holidays and the beginning of school years. There had also been unexplained expenses that David had managed to explain in ways that satisfied me at the time. The extra $600 that had disappeared from our checking account every month had been categorized in various ways over the years. His retirement fund contributions, money set aside for home improvements, savings for future vacations. David handled most of our finances because he was an accountant, and it made sense for him to manage the details. I'd trusted him completely and never questioned his explanations. As evening approached, I realized I hadn't eaten anything all day, but the thought of food made me nauseous. I'd been crying on and off for hours, and my eyes felt swollen and raw. The house felt different now, like I was seeing it for the first time. This was the home David and I had saved for together, the place where we'd planned to grow old together, but apparently it had been funded partially by money that should have been going to his other family. I found myself wondering about Maria and what she thought of our arrangement. Did she know David was married? Had she seen photos of our house, our vacations, our anniversary celebrations? Did she resent me for having the public relationship while she remained in the shadows? Or had David been lying to her too, perhaps telling her that our marriage was troubled or that he was planning to leave me eventually? The questions multiplied in my mind like a virus spreading through every memory I held dear. Our wedding day, when David had promised to forsake all others and hold nothing back from me. Our anniversary dinners, when we'd toasted to our honesty and trust. The nights we'd stayed up talking about our dreams and fears, when David had told me I was his best friend and the only person who truly knew him. Had any of it been real? Or had I been living in a carefully constructed illusion while David's real emotional life was happening somewhere else with people I'd never met? By the time darkness fell over Cedar Falls, I'd made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to bury this secret the way David had buried it for 25 years. I wasn't going to pretend I'd never found the letter or try to protect his memory by keeping his lies intact. Michael Torres deserved to know that his father had died, and more importantly, he deserved to know that David had loved him enough to leave evidence of their relationship. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what David had hidden from me. The letter had answered some questions but raised dozens more. I needed to know how long Michael had known about me, whether Maria had other children, and how David had managed to maintain relationships with both families without either of us becoming suspicious. I also needed to figure out what this meant for Emma, our daughter who was away at college and had no idea she had a half-brother. Emma was 23, just 2 years younger than Michael, which meant she'd grown up as an only child while having a sibling she'd never met. How do you tell your daughter that her father, who she'd idolized and grieved deeply, had been living a double life for her entire existence? As I finally climbed into bed that night, still wearing the same clothes I'd put on that morning, I knew that my life had been divided into 2 distinct periods, before the letter and after the letter. The woman who had woken up that morning had been a widow learning to rebuild her life after losing her husband. The woman trying to fall asleep was someone entirely different, someone who had to face the possibility that the marriage she'd been mourning had never really existed in the first place. The last thing I remembered before exhaustion finally pulled me into restless sleep was the sound of David's voice from a conversation we'd had just months before he died. We'd been discussing our wills and estate planning, and I'd asked him if there was anything important I should know about our finances or legal obligations. He'd kissed my forehead and told me I never had to worry about anything, that he'd taken care of everything and there were no surprises waiting for me. Even in death, David was still lying to me. But now I had the evidence to uncover the truth, and I was going to use it. The next morning brought no relief from the storm raging in my mind. I woke up with David's letter clutched against my chest, the papers wrinkled from my restless sleep. The autumn sunlight streaming through our bedroom, windows felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny accusations. Everything in our room looked the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The framed photos of our anniversaries and vacations now seemed like elaborate stage props in a performance I hadn't known I was giving. I stumbled to the kitchen and mechanically went through the motions of making coffee, using David's favorite mug without thinking. The irony hit me as I poured the steaming liquid into the ceramic cup decorated with "World's Best Husband" that I'd given him 3 Christmases. Oh, my hands shook as I set it down on the counter, coffee sloshing over the rim and staining the granite surface David had been so proud of when we renovated the kitchen 5 years earlier. 5 years ago, Michael would have been 20 then, probably, finishing college while David and I were picking out cabinet hardware and arguing about whether to splurge on the more expensive backsplash. Had David been thinking about his son while we made those domestic decisions? Had he been calculating how much money he could spend on our dream kitchen while still maintaining his $600 monthly payments to Maria? I opened my laptop. At the kitchen table, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I stared at the search bar. Where do you even begin when you need to investigate your own husband's secret life? I started with the most obvious search. Michael Torres, Portland, Oregon. The results were overwhelming, with dozens of LinkedIn profiles, Facebook pages, and professional listings. But when I added 25 years old to the search, the options narrowed significantly. The third result made my heart stop. It was a LinkedIn profile for Michael Roberto Torres, listing him as a graphic designer at a marketing firm in downtown Portland. His profile photo showed a young man with David's distinctive nose and my husband's same way of tilting his head, slightly when he smiled. But it was his eyes that confirmed what the DNA test had already proven. They were David's eyes, the same warm brown color with the same crinkled corners that appeared when he found something genuinely amusing. I clicked through to Michael's profile with trembling fingers, absorbing details about a life that had been unfolding parallel to mine for 2 decades. He'd graduated from Oregon State University with a degree in graphic design, exactly the field David had always said he might have pursued if he hadn't been practical and chosen accounting instead. Michael's work history showed a steady progression from internships during college to his current position at a well-regarded firm. But it was the personal details that cut deepest. Under his volunteer work, Michael had listed Big Brothers Big, sisters as a mentor to fatherless children. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Here was David's son, spending his free time being a father figure to kids who didn't have dads, while his own father had been present but hidden, loving him from the shadows while playing family man with me. I scrolled through the limited photos, visible on his public profile, studying each one for traces of the man I'd been married to. There was Michael at what appeared to be a company retreat, wearing a hiking jacket that looked exactly like one David owned. Another photo showed him at a charity run, sporting the same determined expression David wore during his weekend jogs around Cedar Falls. The resemblance was so strong that looking at Michael's photos felt like seeing David's ghost. My phone rang, startling me out of my digital stalking session. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen, and I realized I'd forgotten about our Wednesday morning coffee date at Miller's. We'd been meeting every week since David's funeral, a routine that had become one of my few anchors in the chaos of grief. "Sarah, honey, are you okay?" Rebecca's voice carried the concern of someone who'd known me long enough to detect distress through a simple hello. "You sound terrible." I looked around my kitchen, taking in the scattered papers from David's envelope, my laptop open to his secret son's LinkedIn profile, and my own reflection in the microwave door showing a woman who looked like she'd been hit by a truck. How do you explain to your best friend that everything she thought she knew about your marriage was a lie? "Becca, I need you to come over," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found something yesterday, and I don't know what to do with it." She arrived 20 minutes later, letting herself in through the front door the way she'd been doing since we bought the house 15 years ago. Rebecca took one look at me and immediately moved into caretaker mode, the same way she'd done when my mother died, and again when David had his heart attack. She guided me to the couch, wrapped me in the throw blanket David used to steal from me during movie nights, and sat down facing me with the patient expression of someone prepared to hear anything. "Tell me," she said simply. So I did. I told her about finding the envelope, about David's letter, about the photographs and bank statements and DNA test results. I showed her Michael's LinkedIn profile and watched her face cycle through the same emotions I'd experienced. Shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, protective fury on my behalf. 25 years, Rebecca said, her voice tight with indignation. "Sarah, he lied to you for your entire marriage, every single day." Hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel more real and somehow more devastating. I'd been hoping that maybe I was overreacting, that there was some explanation that would make this betrayal less complete. But Rebecca's reaction confirmed what I'd been afraid to fully acknowledge. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a fundamental deception that had shaped every aspect of our life together. "I keep thinking about all the times we talked about children," I told her, my voice breaking. "All those years when I thought we were childless by choice, and he already had a son. He watched me grieve for babies I thought we'd never have while he was getting pictures of his kids' soccer games." Rebecca moved closer and pulled me into a hug, the kind of fierce embrace that makes you feel like someone is literally holding you together when you're falling apart. "We're going to figure this out," she said firmly. "But first, we need to understand exactly what David was doing and how long this has been going on." She was right. The emotional processing could come later. But right now, I needed facts. We spread David's documents across the coffee table like evidence in a crime scene investigation. Rebecca, who worked as a paralegal, had a systematic approach to analyzing the materials that helped cut through my emotional overwhelm. "These bank statements show regular transfers going back to before your wedding," she observed, pointing to the earliest records. "But look at this. The amounts increased over time. It started at $300 a month and gradually went up to $600. I studied the pattern she was showing me. The increases seemed to correspond with major milestones. When Michael started school, when he reached high school, when he began college. David had been adjusting his support based on Michael's changing needs, the way any involved father would do. The realization that David had been thinking about Michael's future, planning for his education and development, made the betrayal feel even more personal. "Sarah, look at this," Rebecca said, holding up one of the photographs. It showed Michael at what appeared to be a high school graduation ceremony, wearing a cap and gown and standing between a woman who must have been Maria and an older man I didn't recognize. Do you think Maria remarried? Because if she did, that means Michael had a stepfather while David was sending money and trying to be involved from a distance. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If Maria had moved on with her life and married someone else, it would explain why David's involvement had remained secret. It would also mean that Michael had grown up with a father figure who was present and available, while his biological father watched from the sidelines. I examined the photo more closely, noting the body language between the three adults. The older man had his hand on Michael's shoulder in a gesture that seemed natural and comfortable, the way someone would touch a child they'd helped raise. Maria was smiling broadly, but there was something in her expression that seemed guarded when I looked at her in relation to this man. I need to know more about Maria, I said, turning back to my laptop. If I'm going to understand what David was doing, I need to understand who he was doing it with. Finding Maria Torres proved easier than I'd expected. A quick search of Maria Torres Portland, Oregon education led me to the website of Roosevelt Elementary School, where she was listed as a third-grade teacher. Her staff photo showed a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked like exactly the type of person who would dedicate her life to teaching children, and I found myself wondering what she'd thought about David's divided loyalties. The school's website included brief staff biographies, and Maria's mentioned that she'd been teaching for over 20 years and had a special interest in helping children from diverse backgrounds succeed academically. It also noted that she lived in Portland with her family, which confirmed Rebecca's suspicion that Maria had married someone else. "She looks nice," Rebecca observed, reading over my shoulder. I mean, that doesn't make what happened okay, but she doesn't look like someone who would deliberately set out to ruin a marriage. That was part of what made this situation so complicated. I wanted to hate Maria, to blame her for enabling David's deception, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she might have been as much a victim of David's compartmentalization as I was. According to his letter, she'd asked him to keep Michael a secret, but that request had come from someone who was young and probably scared about raising a child alone. Maria couldn't have known that David would go on to build an entire marriage based on hiding her son's existence. As I scrolled through more search results, I found a local newspaper article from 3 years ago featuring Maria's classroom winning a district-wide science fair. The photo accompanying the article showed her surrounded by students, including one boy who looked remarkably like a younger version of Michael. The caption identified him as Alex Torres Mendoza, and I realized this might be Maria's other child, Michael's half-brother. "She has another son," I told Rebecca, pointing to the screen. "Look at the last name, Torres Mendoza. She must have married someone named Mendoza and had another child." The implications hit me immediately. Not only had David been supporting Michael while lying to me, but Michael had grown up with a half-brother, in a family that probably seemed complete and normal from the outside. Meanwhile, Emma had grown up believing she was an only child while actually having 2 half-brothers she'd never met. I felt a fresh wave of anger, not just at David's deception but at the ripple effects of his choices. Emma deserved to know she had siblings. Michael deserved to know his father had died. Alex, who was probably around 15 based on the photo, deserved to understand his family history. David's decision to keep secrets hadn't just affected me and Maria. It had shaped the lives of 3 young people who had never been given the chance to make their own choices about their relationships with each other. "I have to contact her," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I have to tell Maria that David is dead." Rebecca looked concerned. "Sarah, are you sure you're ready for that conversation? It's only been 1 day since you found out about this. Maybe you should take some time to process everything before you reach out." But I was already composing an email in my head. I couldn't let Maria continue believing that David was still alive and simply choosing not to be in contact. If he'd been planning to tell me about Michael before Christmas, as his letter suggested, then he might have also been planning to change the nature of his relationship with Maria and his son. She deserved to know that those plans had died with him. I found the school's general contact information and crafted what felt like the most difficult email I'd ever written. I identified myself as David Mitchell's widow and explained that I'd recently discovered evidence of his relationship with Michael. I mentioned that David had passed away 6 months ago and that I thought she should know. I kept it brief and as non-accusatory as possible, ending with my phone number and an invitation for her to call when she was ready. After I sent the email, Rebecca and I sat in silence for several minutes, both of us staring at my laptop screen as if expecting an immediate response. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the way it had in the days immediately following David's funeral, when every sound seemed amplified and every silence felt loaded with meaning. "What are you going to tell Emma?" Rebecca finally asked. That was the question I'd been avoiding since yesterday. My daughter was in her senior year at Portland State University, just 2 hours away from where her half-brother was working and living his own life. Emma had inherited David's practical nature and my tendency to ask direct questions, which meant she wouldn't accept vague explanations or half-truths about why I suddenly needed to have serious conversations about family history. "I don't know," I admitted. "How do you tell your child that everything she thought she knew about her father was wrong? That he had another family he cared about just as much as he cared about us?" Emma had been devastated by David's death. They'd had the kind of close father-daughter relationship that made other people envious, full of inside jokes and shared interests that I sometimes felt excluded from in the most loving way possible. David had taught Emma to change her own oil, to appreciate jazz music, and to stand up for herself in ways that I'd never learned to do. She'd inherited his sense of humor and his ability to find practical solutions to complicated problems. The thought of tarnishing Emma's memory of her father felt almost as devastating as learning about his deception in the first place. But I also knew that Emma deserved the truth, especially if there was a chance she might want to have a relationship with Michael. They were practically the same age, both living in Portland, both navigating their early careers and adult relationships. They might actually like each other if they had the chance to meet. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped, thinking it might be a response from Maria. Instead, it was Emma, sending me a photo of her lunch with the caption, "Trying to eat healthier like Dad always nagged me to do." The innocent message felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Emma was still living in the world where David had been an honest man who cared about her nutrition and her future. I was now living in a world where I questioned every piece of advice David had ever given, wondering if it was genuine concern or part of his elaborate performance as a devoted family man. "I think you need to tell Emma soon," Rebecca said gently, "before she finds out some other way. If David was involved in Michael's life for 25 years, there might be other people who know about the connection. You don't want Emma to hear about this from someone else." She was right, but the thought of having that conversation made me feel sick. I'd already lost David. I couldn't bear the thought of watching Emma lose her idealized memory of him too. But keeping this secret would make me complicit in David's deception, and I'd already decided I wasn't going to protect his lies at the expense of my own integrity. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang with Emma's number. I stared at the screen for several rings before answering, wondering if somehow she'd sensed that something was wrong. "Mom, you sound weird," she said immediately, with the directness that reminded me so much of David. "Are you okay? You've been kind of off since Dad's birthday last month." David's birthday. The day I'd spent crying over his grave while apparently his son was probably also thinking about the father he'd lost without knowing it. The coincidence felt cruel, like the universe was determined to remind me that grief was more complicated than I'd understood. "Emma, I need to see you," I said, making the decision as I spoke. "Can you come home this weekend? I have something important to discuss with you." There was a pause before she responded, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Mom, you're scaring me. Is everything okay? Are you sick?" "I'm not sick," I assured her quickly. "But I found something of your father's that we need to talk about. It's complicated, and I'd rather discuss it in person." "I can drive up tonight after my last class," Emma offered. "I don't have anything important happening tomorrow anyway." After we hung up, Rebecca helped me clean up the scattered documents and photos, creating a more organized presentation of the evidence I'd found. We arranged everything in chronological order, starting with the earliest bank statements and ending with the recent DNA test results. It felt like preparing for a trial where I was simultaneously the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the primary witness. "Are you going to show her everything?" Rebecca asked as we sorted the photographs of Michael into a separate pile. "I think I have to," I said. "Emma's not a child anymore. She deserves to see the evidence and make her own decisions about what it means." That evening, I barely slept again. I kept imagining how the conversation with Emma might go, rehearsing different ways to break the news and trying to anticipate her questions. Would she be angry at David for lying? Would she be angry at me for disrupting her memories? Would she want to meet Michael, or would she prefer to pretend he didn't exist? But more than anything, I kept thinking about David's letter and his mention of planning to tell me the truth before Christmas. That meant he'd been preparing to upend our lives voluntarily, to finally come clean about the secret he'd been carrying for 25 years. What had changed? Why had he decided that this was the year to stop lying? I suspected it had something to do with Michael turning 25 and perhaps asking more questions about his father's absence from his daily life. Or maybe David had realized that maintaining two separate families was becoming unsustainable as we all got older. Whatever his motivation, he'd run out of time to explain himself, leaving me to piece together not just what he'd done, but why he'd done it. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges that David had always loved, I made myself another cup of coffee and sat at our kitchen table surrounded by the evidence of his double life. In a few hours, Emma would be here, and I would have to find a way to tell her that the father she'd loved and admired had been living a lie for her entire life. But I was also going to tell her that she had a brother, and that maybe something good could come from this devastating revelation. Maybe David's secret could become the foundation for new relationships and connections he'd never intended to create. Maybe his lies could somehow lead to truth, even if he wasn't here to see it happen. Emma arrived at 7:30 that evening, her Honda Civic pulling into our driveway with the familiar sound of a muffler that needed attention. I watched from the kitchen window as she gathered her overnight bag and laptop case, moving with the efficient energy that had always reminded me of David. She'd inherited his ability to pack light but thoroughly, his habit of checking his phone one last time before entering a building, and his way of pausing at the front door to really look at the house before coming inside. When she stepped through the door, I was struck by how much she'd grown into herself over the past few months. Grief had matured her in ways that college hadn't, adding a thoughtfulness to her expressions that made her seem older than 23. She hugged me tightly, the way she'd been doing since David's funeral, as if she was afraid I might disappear too. "Okay, Mom," she said, settling onto the couch with the directness that was pure David. "You've had me worried sick all day. What's going on?" I'd rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but sitting across from my daughter in the living room where David used to read his mystery novels, I found myself completely unprepared. How do you destroy someone's fundamental understanding of their family? How do you take away the security of believing your parents were honest with you? "Emma, I found something yesterday while I was going through your father's things," I began, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. Something he left for me to find, but something he should have told me 25 years ago. Her face immediately shifted into alert concern, the expression she'd worn throughout David's final weeks when we'd all been bracing for bad news. "What kind of something?" I handed her David's letter first, watching her face as she read his careful explanation of Michael's existence. Emma was a fast reader, another trait inherited from her father, but I could see her slowing down as the implications became clear. Her eyes widened when she reached the part about the DNA test, and her hand went to her mouth when she read about David's plans to introduce us to Michael before Christmas. "He had a son," she said quietly, looking up at me with confusion rather than anger. "I have a brother. A half-brother," I corrected gently. "And according to these documents, he's been living in Portland your entire life." Emma set the letter aside and picked up the folder of photographs, going through them methodically the way she approached everything else. I watched her study Michael's face in each image, looking for family resemblances the same way I had. When she reached the photo of his college graduation, she held it closer to the light. "He looks like Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like, really looks like him. The nose, the way he stands, even his smile." "I know. Mom, he's my age. We could have been friends growing up. We could have gone to the same schools, had play dates, shared holidays." Emma's voice was getting stronger, but I could hear the hurt building underneath. "Dad let me grow up thinking I was an only child when I had a brother living 2 hours away." That was exactly what I'd been afraid she'd focus on. Not David's betrayal of our marriage, but the opportunities for sibling relationships that had been stolen from her. Emma had always wanted brothers and sisters, asking repeatedly as a child why we didn't have more babies. David and I had explained it as a choice based on finances and timing, but Emma had never quite accepted that explanation. "There's more," I said, showing her the bank statements and the evidence of David's ongoing financial support. He wasn't just hiding Michael's existence. He was actively involved in his life, attending events, providing support, being a father to him while being a father to you. Emma studied the financial records with the analytical skills she'd inherited from David's accounting background. $600 a month, she observed. "That's more than my car payment and insurance combined, for 25 years. She looked up at me with a new realization. "Mom, is this why we never took those big vacations other families took? Why you always said we needed to be careful about college expenses?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because I hadn't made that connection yet. All those times David had suggested we choose the more economical option for family activities. All his concerns about Emma's college costs. All his insistence on budget-friendly anniversaries and modest Christmas gifts. Had our family's financial constraints been artificial, created by David's need to support his other child? "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still trying to understand how this affected our lives in ways I didn't realize." Emma set down the bank statements and leaned back against the couch cushions, staring at the ceiling the way she'd done as a teenager when she was processing difficult information. "Have you contacted him?" "Michael, I mean. Does he know Dad died?" "I reached out to his mother today, Maria Torres. She's a teacher in Portland, and according to David's letter, she's the one who asked him to keep Michael a secret originally." "What did you say to her?" "Just that I was David's widow and that I'd discovered evidence of their relationship. I told her David had passed away and that I thought she should know." Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing everything I'd shared. I could see her working through the implications, considering questions I hadn't thought to ask yet. Finally, she looked at me with an expression that was both mature and heartbreakingly young. "Mom, are you okay? I mean, finding out your husband had a secret family has to be devastating. How are you handling this?" Her concern for me in the middle of her own shock reminded me why David had been so proud of the young woman Emma had become. Even when her own world was being turned upside down, she was thinking about other people's emotional needs. "I'm not okay," I said honestly. "I feel like our entire marriage was built on a lie." Every conversation we had about children, every financial decision we made, every time he said he loved me and that we had no secrets between us. I don't know what was real and what was performance. The love was real, Emma said firmly. Mom, I saw how Dad looked at you every single day. For 23 years. That wasn't performance. He adored you. But he also loved Michael and Maria enough to lie to me for our entire marriage to protect them. Emma considered this, twisting her hair around her finger the way she'd done since childhood when she was thinking hard about something. Maybe he got trapped, she said finally. Maybe he made one decision to keep it secret temporarily, and then it became impossible to tell the truth without destroying everything. Her willingness to find explanations for David's behavior made me both proud of her compassion and frustrated that she was already working to excuse his deception. But Emma had always been a problem solver, someone who looked for ways to fix broken situations rather than dwelling on blame. Do you want to meet him? I asked. Michael, if we can arrange it. Yes, she said immediately, then paused. But I'm also scared. What if he hates us? What if he blames us for Dad not being more involved in his life? What if he's angry that Dad chose us over him? Those were exactly the fears I'd been carrying since yesterday. Michael had grown up knowing his father existed, but wasn't present in his daily life. How do you explain to someone that their father was busy playing family man with another family, attending their school events and family dinners while missing his biological son's milestones? There's something else, I said, showing Emma the newspaper clipping about Maria's other son. Michael has a half-brother named Alex. Maria remarried someone named Mendoza and had another child. Emma studied the photo of Alex Torres Mendoza, noting the family resemblance that was visible even in the grainy newspaper image. So Michael grew up with a stepfather and a half-brother while Dad sent money from the sidelines? It looks that way. That makes it even more complicated, Emma said. If Michael had a father figure in his life, maybe Dad's absence wasn't as devastating as we're imagining. Maybe this Mendoza guy was a good stepfather who filled that role. I hadn't considered that possibility, but Emma was right. If Maria had created a stable, loving family with her second husband, then David's compartmentalized involvement might have been less traumatic for Michael than I'd assumed. It was possible that Michael had grown up feeling complete and secure, with David's financial support serving as a safety net rather than a replacement for paternal presence. My phone buzzed with an email notification, and my heart jumped when I saw Maria Torres's name in my inbox. Emma moved closer to me on the couch as I opened the message, both of us holding our breath as I read Maria's response. Dear Sarah, the email began, I was shocked to receive your message today. I had no idea that David had passed away, and I am deeply sorry for your loss. This situation is complicated, and I think we need to talk in person rather than through email. Would you be willing to meet me tomorrow afternoon? I can drive to Cedar Falls if that would be easier for you. There are things about David's involvement in Michael's life that you need to understand, and questions I need to ask you about what he told you about us. Please call me when you get this message. The email included Maria's phone number and ended with a postscript that made my breath catch. Michael doesn't know that David has died. I haven't told him yet because I wanted to speak with you first. She wants to meet in person, I told Emma, handing her my phone so she could read the message herself. She sounds reasonable, Emma observed, and careful. She's thinking about Michael's feelings, which is good. Are you going to call her now? I looked at the clock and realized it was past 8:30. I should probably wait until tomorrow morning. She's had a shock today too, and she probably needs time to process everything before we talk. Emma nodded, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you want me to come with you when you meet her? The protective part of me wanted to shield Emma from what could be a difficult conversation, but the practical part recognized that she deserved to be involved in decisions that would affect her relationship with her newfound half-brother. She was an adult, and this was her family too. "If you want to come, I'd like to have you there," I said. "But you should know that this conversation might be hard to hear. We might learn things about your father that change how you think about him." "I already know he lied to us for 25 years, Emma pointed out. "How much worse can it get?" That night, neither Emma nor I slept well. I could hear her moving around in her childhood bedroom, probably doing what I was doing, staring at the ceiling and trying to reimagine our family history with this new information. Every memory from the past 25 years was now suspect. Every explanation David had given for his behavior now potentially false. I found myself thinking about specific moments that might have been connected to Michael's life in ways I'd never understood. David's occasional weekend trips to Portland that he'd described as networking opportunities. His reluctance to commit to certain vacation dates because of work conflicts that never seemed to materialize into actual work. The way he sometimes seemed distracted during Emma's school events, checking his phone more frequently than usual. Had he been missing Michael's events to attend Emma's? Had he been trying to balance two families without either one feeling neglected? The logistics alone seemed exhausting, and I couldn't imagine the emotional toll of constantly compartmentalizing his attention and affection. The next morning, I called Maria at 9 o'clock sharp, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice professional but warm, the way I imagined she sounded when she talked to concerned parents about their children's progress in school. "Thank you for calling," she said. "I've been awake most of the night thinking about this situation." "I'm sorry to spring this on you," I said. "I only found David's letter 2 days ago, and I'm still trying to understand everything myself." "Can you tell me how he died?" Maria asked gently. "He seemed healthy the last time I saw him." The question caught me off guard. "When did you last see him?" There was a pause before Maria answered. "About 3 months before he passed? Away." He came to Michael's birthday dinner in February. We met at a restaurant in Portland, the same place we'd been meeting for the past few years. February. David had told me he was attending a weekend accounting conference in Portland that February weekend, complete with fake business cards from the supposed event that I'd found in his wallet after he died. He'd actually been celebrating his son's 25th birthday while I'd spent that Saturday reorganizing our tax documents and thinking about how dedicated David was to his professional development. "He had a heart attack," I told Maria. "Sudden and massive. He didn't suffer." "I'm so sorry," she said, and I could hear genuine grief in her voice. "David was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you." Her immediate defense of David surprised me. I'd expected anger or resentment from a woman who'd been relegated to secret status for 2.5 decades, but Maria sounded protective of him. "Can we meet today?" I asked. "I have so many questions, and my daughter Emma would like to come with me if that's okay." "Of course. I think it would be good for Emma to be there. And Sarah, I want you to know that Michael is a wonderful young man. David did right by him, even if the circumstances were complicated." We arranged to meet at 2 o'clock at a coffee shop in Salem, roughly halfway between Cedar Falls and Portland. Maria suggested somewhere neutral where we could talk privately without worrying about running into people either of us knew. After we hung up, I realized I was both eager for and terrified of this conversation. Emma was already dressed and ready. When I went to check on her, sitting at her old desk with her laptop open and a notebook beside her. "I've been making a list of questions," she said. "Things I want to know about Michael and about Dad's relationship with him." I looked over her shoulder at the neat handwriting that reminded me so much of David's. She'd organized her questions into categories. About Michael personally, about Dad's involvement, about the financial arrangements, and about the future. The systematic approach was pure David, but the emotional maturity behind the questions was all Emma. "Good thinking," I said. "I've been so overwhelmed by the emotional aspects that I haven't thought strategically about what information we need. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Emma looked up at me with the serious expression she'd worn since childhood when she was about to ask a question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. Anything. "Do you think Dad loved Michael as, much as he loved me?" The question broke my heart because I could see how much the answer mattered to her. Emma had always been secure in David's love, confident that she was the center of his world in a way that had made me sometimes feel like I was watching their special relationship from the outside. The possibility that she'd been sharing that central position without knowing it was threatening her fundamental sense of self. "I think your father had a big heart," I said carefully. "And I think he loved you both differently, but completely. Michael's existence doesn't diminish how much your father loved you. But it means I wasn't as special as I thought I was." "No, sweetheart. It means your father was capable of loving more people than we realized. That doesn't make his love for you less special. It makes him more complex than we understood." As we drove toward Salem, Emma was quiet for most of the trip, staring out the passenger window at the October landscape that David had always loved. The trees were at peak color, showing off the reds and golds that made Oregon autumns famous. David used to take long drives during this season just to appreciate the changing leaves, and I wondered now if some of those drives had taken him to Portland to spend time with Michael. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked as we pulled into the coffee shop parking lot. "Terrified," I admitted. "But I need to understand what David was thinking, and Maria is the only person who can help me do that." We spotted Maria immediately when we walked into the coffee shop. She was sitting at a corner table, wearing a navy cardigan and looking exactly like her staff photo from the school website. She was attractive in an understated way, with laugh lines around her eyes and gray streaking through her dark hair that she wore pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like someone you'd trust with your children, someone who would remember their names and ask about their pets. When she saw us approaching, Maria stood and extended her hand to me with a smile that seemed genuinely warm despite the awkward circumstances. "You must be Sarah. I can see where Emma gets her looks." Emma shook Maria's hand next, and I watched both women study each other with curiosity rather than hostility. There was no tension between them, which surprised me. I'd expected this meeting to feel more adversarial, but Maria's demeanor was open and welcoming. "Thank you for coming," Maria said as we settled into our chairs. "I know this situation is strange for all of us. Can you tell us about Michael? Emma asked immediately, her directness cutting through any potential awkwardness. "I want to know what my brother is like." Maria's face lit up when she started talking about her son, and I could see immediately how proud she was of him. "Michael is thoughtful and creative. A lot like David in his problem-solving approach, but more artistic. He's been drawing and designing since he was little, always making elaborate plans for projects. He's kind to everyone, volunteers with kids who don't have fathers, and he's been asking more questions about David lately." "What kind of questions?" I asked. Why David couldn't be more involved, why they couldn't spend holidays together, whether David was ashamed of him. Maria's expression grew sad. "Michael is 25 now, and he's starting to think about his own future, about marriage and children. He wants to understand why his father chose to stay in the background of his life." The pain in Maria's voice made it clear that David's compartmentalized approach had hurt Michael more than his financial support had helped. A young man growing up with questions about his father's commitment, wondering if he was somehow not worth public acknowledgement, was experiencing a different kind of damage than I'd considered. "Why did you ask David to keep Michael a secret originally?" Emma asked. Maria sighed and wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "I was 22 and scared. David and I had only been dating for a few months when I got pregnant, and we both knew we weren't ready for marriage. When David said he wanted to support the baby financially, I thought it would be easier if we kept things simple and separate. I didn't want him to feel trapped, and I didn't want to complicate his life. But it went on for 25 years, I pointed out. I know. And that's my fault too. When David told me he'd met someone serious and was thinking about marriage, I panicked. I was afraid that if his new girlfriend knew about Michael, she might pressure him to stop the support payments or limit his involvement. So I asked him to wait to tell you until your relationship was more established. But he never told me. No, he didn't. And as the years went by, it became harder and harder to bring up. David was torn between wanting to be honest with you and being afraid of destroying your marriage. He loved you, Sarah. That was never in question. Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope similar to the one I'd found in David's closet. After you called yesterday, I went through my own collection of things David had given me over the years. I thought you should see some of this. She handed me photographs I'd never seen, images of David at Michael's birthday parties and school events, but also pictures that included me. There was a photo of David at our 10th anniversary dinner, showing our table with me laughing at something he'd said. Another showed David at Emma's high school graduation, beaming with pride as she walked across the stage. He carried pictures of both his families, Maria explained. He showed Michael photos of you and Emma, told him about your accomplishments and your personalities. Michael knows that David loved his other family deeply. Emma leaned forward, studying the photos with fascination. He told Michael about us? Oh, yes. Michael knows you're a brilliant student studying environmental science. He knows Sarah is a kind woman who volunteers at the animal shelter. David was proud of both his families, even if he couldn't bring them together. The revelation that David had been sharing our lives with Michael while hiding Michael's existence from us felt like another layer of betrayal, but also strangely comforting. At least Michael hadn't grown up thinking his father was ashamed of him or preferred his other family. He'd known he was loved and valued, even if that love had to remain secret. What happens now? I asked Maria. How do we tell Michael that David is gone? And how do we explain why he's just finding out now? Maria looked between Emma and me, her expression thoughtful. I think Michael should meet both of you. He deserves to know his father's family, and I think it would help him understand David's choices better. But Sarah, you need to understand that Michael might be angry. Not at you, but at the situation. He's been asking to meet you for years, and David always said the timing wasn't right. He wanted to meet us? Emma asked. Very much. Especially you, Emma. He always wondered what it would be like to have a sister. The irony was overwhelming. While Emma had been wishing for siblings, Michael had been wishing to meet the sister he knew existed but couldn't contact. David's secret had robbed both of them of a relationship they might have treasured. Can we arrange a meeting? I asked. Soon? Maria nodded. Let me talk to Michael first. Explain that David has passed away and that you've reached out. Then, we can plan something that feels comfortable for everyone. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Maria touched my arm gently. Sarah, I want you to know that David never spoke badly about you or your marriage. He always said you were the love of his life, and that his biggest regret was not finding a way to bring all the people he loved together. Driving home, Emma and I were both quiet, processing everything we'd learned. David's deception was still painful, but understanding Maria's perspective and learning about Michael's character had shifted something in my feelings about the situation. This wasn't a simple story of betrayal. It was a complicated story of people trying to do right by each other in an impossible situation. I want to meet him, Emma said as we pulled into our driveway. Michael, I mean. I want to meet my brother. Even though it means accepting that Dad lied to us? Mom, I've been thinking about what Maria said, about Dad carrying pictures of both families. Maybe he wasn't choosing between us. Maybe he was trying to love all of us the best way he knew how, even if it wasn't the right way. That night, I sat in David's study surrounded by all the evidence of his secret life, but instead of feeling angry, I felt sad. Sad for Michael, who'd grown up with a father who couldn't acknowledge him publicly. Sad for Emma, who'd missed out on knowing her brother. Sad for Maria, who'd carried the burden of keeping David's secret. And sad for David, who'd created a situation where everyone he loved was hurt by his inability to find a way to tell the truth. But I was also hopeful. Tomorrow, Maria would tell Michael about David's death and about our desire to meet him. Soon, Emma would meet the brother she'd never known existed. David's secret was finally ending, and maybe something better could begin in its place. 3 days later, I stood in the parking lot of Laurelhurst Park in Portland, watching Emma pace nervously between the picnic tables while we waited for Maria and Michael to arrive. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. David would have loved this weather, would have suggested we take a walk around the park's lake just to enjoy the changing seasons. Now I was here to meet the son he'd hidden from me for 25 years, in a park he'd probably visited with Michael dozens of times without my knowledge. Emma had changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on jeans and a sweater that she said made her look approachable, but not desperate. She'd been alternating between excitement and terror for the past 3 days, asking me repeatedly what she should say to a brother she'd never known existed. I had no answers for her because I was struggling with my own conflicting emotions about this meeting. Part of me was curious about Michael as a person, eager to see the young man David had been so proud of that he'd risked our marriage to maintain a relationship with him. But another part of me was still angry about the deception, still processing the reality that David had been living a double life with such skill that I'd never suspected anything. Meeting Michael would make David's betrayal concrete in a way that reading his letter and seeing photographs hadn't quite accomplished. "They're here," Emma said suddenly, pointing toward the park entrance where a silver Honda was pulling into the parking area. I watched as Maria got out of the driver's seat, moving with the same careful efficiency I'd noticed at the coffee shop. Then the passenger door opened, and Michael Torres stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. Even from a distance, the resemblance to David was startling. Michael had inherited David's height and build, his way of standing with one hand in his pocket, even his habit of glancing around to get his bearings before walking toward a destination. As they approached our picnic table, I could see Michael's nervousness in the way he kept adjusting his jacket and running his hand through his dark hair. He was handsome in the same understated way David had been, with intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed genuine but cautious. When he was close enough for me to see his face clearly, I felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond physical resemblance. This was David's son, carrying David's expressions and mannerisms in ways that made my heart ache. "Sarah, Emma," Maria said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Michael." Michael stepped forward and extended his hand to me first, his grip firm and confident in the way David had taught Emma to shake hands. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a slight formality that suggested he'd been rehearsing this moment. "I'm so sorry for your loss. My mother told me about my father's heart attack." The words "my father" hit me unexpectedly hard. For 25 years, David had been my husband in my mind, the man who belonged to Emma and me. Hearing someone else claim him as family forced me to confront the reality that David had belonged to more people than I'd known, had been loved and needed by people I'd never met. "Thank you," I managed to say. "And please, call me Sarah." Michael turned to Emma next, and I watched my daughter's face transform as she looked into the eyes that were so similar to her father's. "I can't believe I have a sister," Michael said softly. "I've wondered about you my entire life." "I just found out about you 4 days ago," Emma replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I always wanted a brother." They stared at each other. For a moment, taking in the family resemblance that was obvious to anyone who looked. Michael had David's nose and jawline, but his coloring was darker, inherited from Maria's Guatemalan heritage. Emma had gotten David's eyes and smile, but her hair and build came from my side of the family. Looking at them together, I could see how they were connected through David while being completely different people shaped by entirely separate lives. We sat down at the picnic table, Maria and Michael on one side, Emma and I on the other, like two families meeting for the first time rather than pieces of the same family finally coming together. The awkwardness was palpable, but underneath it was a current of curiosity and genuine interest in getting to know each other. "I brought some things I thought you might want to see," Michael said, pulling a manila envelope from his backpack. Pictures and letters from Dad over the years. He spread photographs across the picnic table, images that showed a side of David I'd never witnessed. There was David teaching a younger Michael how to throw a baseball in what looked like this same park. David and Michael at a Portland Trail Blazers game, both wearing team jerseys and grinning at the camera. David helping a teenage Michael work. On what appeared to be a science fair project, the two of them bent over a display board with intense concentration. But it was the candid shots that affected me most deeply. David laughing at something Michael had said during what looked like a casual dinner. David looking proud and emotional at Michael's high school graduation. David and Michael hiking on what I recognized as Mount Hood, both of them wearing the kind of serious hiking gear that David had always claimed he never had time to use. "He took me hiking every few months," Michael explained, noticing my focus on the outdoor photos. Said it was important for men to spend time in nature together, away from distractions. Emma picked up one of the hiking photos, studying David's expression. "He never took me hiking," she said quietly. "He always said he was too busy with work." The comment hung in the air, highlighting one of the cruel ironies of David's divided life. In trying to be a father to both of his children, he'd apparently given them different experiences, different versions of himself. Michael had gotten the outdoorsy, adventurous David who had time for extended hiking trips. Emma had gotten the practical, career-focused David who prioritized academic achievement and financial stability. "He talked about you all the time," Michael said, looking directly at Emma. "He was so proud of your grades, your college acceptance, your environmental science program. He showed me your photo when you graduated from high school, and he couldn't stop talking about how intelligent and determined you were." "He showed you my graduation photo?" "He carried pictures of you in his wallet, next to pictures of me. He said you were going to change the world someday, that you had the kind of mind that could solve big problems." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "He said the same thing to me, but he never told me he was saying it about me to someone else." Maria had been quiet during this exchange, letting her son and Emma begin to build a connection, but now she spoke up. "Michael, show them the letters." Michael pulled out a small stack of handwritten notes, letters that David had apparently given him over the years for birthdays and special occasions. Emma leaned closer as Michael read excerpts aloud, hearing David's voice in words she'd never seen before. "This one's from when I graduated college," Michael said, unfolding a piece of David's professional letterhead. He wrote, "I'm prouder of you than you'll ever know. Watching you become the man you are today has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. I wish I could shout about your accomplishments from every rooftop, but for now, know that your old man thinks you're extraordinary." But the phrase, "your old man," made my breath catch. David had never referred to himself that way with Emma, had always been more formal in his expressions of pride. It suggested a different kind of relationship with Michael, perhaps more relaxed, because it existed outside the scrutiny of daily family life. "What did you know about us?" I asked Michael. "About me and Emma?" "A lot, actually," Michael replied. "Dad told me you were a kindergarten teacher who loved children and animals. He said you had the most generous heart of anyone he'd ever met, and that you made him want to be a better person. He showed me pictures of your house, told me about your garden and how you rescued injured birds." The accuracy of these details was unsettling. David had been paying attention to the things that mattered to me, sharing intimate knowledge of my personality and interests with his secret son. It felt like another layer of betrayal, but also strangely touching that he'd spoken of me with obvious affection. And he told me Emma was brilliant and funny, that she could argue with him about politics and current events in ways that impressed him, Michael continued. He said she had strong opinions about everything and the intelligence to back them up. He was excited about her environmental science program because he thought it suited her personality perfectly. Emma was crying openly now, overwhelmed by hearing her father's pride expressed through someone else's voice. "Why couldn't he just tell us about you?" she asked. "Why did he have to keep us all separate?" Michael looked uncomfortable, glancing at his mother before answering. "I think he got trapped by his own choices. When I was little, it seemed normal that my dad couldn't live with us because my parents weren't married. But as I got older, I started asking more questions about why he couldn't spend holidays with us, why I couldn't visit his house, why he couldn't come to my school events unless they were during the day when other families wouldn't be there." "He came to your school events?" Emma asked. "Some of them. He came to my college graduation, but he sat in the back and left before the reception. He came to a few of my baseball games in high school, but he always sat away from the other parents." Michael's expression grew sad. "I realized when I was about 15 that my dad was living a completely different life somewhere else, and that I wasn't part of his real family." The pain in Michael's voice made it clear that David's compartmentalization had hurt him deeply. Growing up knowing your father was choosing to remain on the periphery of your life, that he had another family he prioritized over spending time with you, would create its own kind of emotional damage. "But you weren't the secret," I said suddenly, understanding hitting me like a revelation. "We were the secret too. David was keeping all of us separate from each other, not choosing one family over the other." Michael nodded. "That's what I finally figured out. Dad wasn't rejecting me. He was trying to protect everyone by keeping his two lives from colliding. But it meant none of us got the whole truth about who he was." We spent the next 2 hours sharing stories about David, comparing our different experiences of the same man. Emma told Michael about David's terrible jokes and his obsession with mystery novels. Michael shared memories of David's hiking knowledge and his ability to fix anything mechanical. I found myself describing David's gentleness with injured animals and his habit of bringing me wildflowers he'd picked during his morning runs. Gradually, a more complete picture of David emerged, one that none of us had possessed individually. He'd been an outdoorsman with Michael, an intellectual companion with Emma, and a romantic partner with me. He'd adapted himself to what each of us needed from him, but in doing so, he'd never allowed any of us to know him completely. "I have something else," Michael said as the afternoon shadows grew longer. He pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it to Emma. "Dad gave this to me for my 21st birthday, but he said it originally belonged to his daughter, and that someday I should make sure she got it back." Emma unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a silver bracelet that I recognized immediately. It had been Emma's favorite piece of jewelry as a teenager, a delicate chain with small charms that represented her interests. A tiny book, a musical note, a small globe. She'd lost it during her sophomore year of high school and had been heartbroken because David had given it to her for her 16th birthday. "How did he have this?" Emma asked, fastening the bracelet around her wrist with shaking hands. "He told me he'd borrowed it to have it cleaned and repaired, but then you'd moved away for college before he could return it," Michael explained. "He said he wanted to make sure it found its way back to you eventually." I remembered Emma searching everywhere for that bracelet, remembered David helping her look through her room and even offering to buy her a replacement. He'd had it the entire time, had apparently given it to Michael as a way of creating a tangible connection between his two families. "He was planning something," I said, pieces clicking together in my mind. The bracelet, the letter he left for me, his mention of telling me the truth before Christmas. He was working up to bringing us all together. Maria nodded. He'd been talking about it for months. He was tired of keeping secrets, tired of missing important moments because he couldn't figure out how to be in both places at once. He said he was getting older and didn't want to die with this secret unresolved. The irony was devastating. David had been planning to fix the situation he'd created, to finally tell the truth and give all of us the chance to know each other. But he'd run out of time, leaving us to find each other in the aftermath of his death rather than through his confession. As we prepared to leave the park, Michael asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens now? I mean, we've met each other, but where do we go from here? Emma answered before I could. I want to get to know you. I want to hear more stories about Dad, and I want to tell you about my life. I want to be your sister, if you want that too. I'd like that, Michael said, smiling genuinely for the first time that afternoon. I've always wondered what it would be like to have a sibling. I looked at Maria, wondering if she was as overwhelmed by this day as I was. What about you? I asked her. How do you feel about Emma and Michael developing a relationship? I think it's what David would have wanted, she replied. He loved both of his children deeply, and I think he would be happy to know they're going to know each other. As we exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans to meet again, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the past 25 years. David's secret hadn't just been about hiding Michael's existence. It had been about his inability to find a way to love all of us openly, without hurting anyone. Driving home, Emma was quiet for most of the trip, fingering the bracelet that had found its way back to her through such a complicated route. Mom, she said finally, I think I understand why Dad did what he did. How so? He wasn't choosing between us. He was trying to protect everyone he loved from the pain of a messy situation. He made a mistake when he was young, and then he spent 25 years trying to fix it without hurting anyone. But his solution hurt everyone anyway. I know, but his intentions were good. He was trying to be responsible to Michael while building a life with us. He just got trapped by his own kindness. That night, I sat in David's study reading through his letter one more time. But now I understood it differently. This wasn't just a confession of betrayal. It was the desperate attempt of a man who'd painted himself into an impossible corner and couldn't find a way out without destroying the people he loved. Over the following weeks, Emma and Michael began building a genuine sibling relationship, texting regularly and making plans to spend Thanksgiving together. They discovered they shared David's sense of humor and his stubborn streak, but they developed completely different interests and perspectives based on their separate upbringings. Maria and I developed our own careful friendship, united by our shared experience of loving a man who'd been unable to love us honestly. We met for coffee occasionally, sharing memories of David and helping each other understand the choices he'd made. Michael showed me more photos and letters over time, giving me glimpses of the David I'd never known. In return, I shared stories about David's daily life with Emma and me, helping Michael understand the man who'd been present but hidden in his life. 3 months after our first meeting, Michael asked if he could visit David's grave. Emma and I took him to Cedar Falls Cemetery on a crisp January morning, and we stood together at David's headstone while Michael said goodbye to the father he'd loved from a distance. I forgive you, Dad, Michael said quietly, placing a small stone on top of the granite marker. I understand now that you were doing the best you could with an impossible situation. Emma added her own stone next to Michael's. I forgive you, too. I just wish you'd trusted us enough to tell the truth while you were alive. I placed the third stone, completing a small pile that somehow felt like a family monument. I'm still angry about the lies, I said aloud, speaking to David as much as to Michael and Emma. But I'm grateful that your secret brought us together. Your children deserve to know each other. Standing there between David's 2 children, I realized that his death had accomplished what his life couldn't. By leaving that letter for me to find, by giving Michael the bracelet to return to Emma, by carrying photos of all of us in his wallet, David had created the foundation for relationships he'd been too afraid to build while he was alive. His secret had finally ended, not through confession, but through discovery. And somehow, in the ruins of his deception, we'd found something worth building. A family that was honest about its complications. A family that could love each other despite the lies that had kept us apart. I never got the chance to confront David about his 25 years of lies, never got to hear his explanations or witness his remorse. But I got something better. I got to see his love for Michael and Maria validated, and I got to watch Emma gain the brother she'd always wanted. David's letter had promised to change everything, and it had. Just not in the way any of us had expected. His secret hadn't destroyed us. It had brought us together. And maybe that was the redemption he'd been hoping for all along. The morning of Michael's visit to our house in Cedar Falls arrived with the kind of gentle spring rain that David had always said was perfect for working in the garden. I stood at the kitchen window, watching droplets trace paths down the glass while I waited for Emma to finish setting up the living room for what felt like the most important family gathering we'd ever hosted. It had been 6 months since our first meeting at Laurelhurst Park, and in that time, Michael had become a regular presence in our lives through phone calls, text messages, and carefully planned visits that were helping all of us navigate this new reality. Today was different, though. Today, Michael was coming to see David's home for the first time, to walk through the rooms where his father had lived the other half of his double life. Maria had driven up from Portland with him, and I could see the silver Honda pulling into our driveway through the rain-streaked window. My heart rate picked up as I watched Michael step out of the passenger seat, his dark hair immediately dampening in the drizzle as he looked up at the Victorian house that David had been so proud of. Emma opened the front door before they could knock, greeting Michael with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the past months. Their sibling relationship had blossomed in ways that continued to surprise me, built on shared humor and a deep curiosity about each other's lives. They'd discovered they both inherited David's tendency to overthink problems and his habit of making terrible puns at inappropriate moments. Watching them together was like seeing different aspects of David's personality reflected in two completely different people. "Welcome to Dad's secret headquarters," Emma said with the dark humor she'd developed about our situation. "Prepare yourself for a tour of the life he actually told us about." Michael smiled at her joke, but I could see nervousness in the way. He paused in our entryway, taking in the family photos that lined the hallway walls. His eyes moved from image to image, seeing David at various stages of life with Emma and me, probably trying to reconcile these glimpses of domestic happiness with the father he'd known only in carefully scheduled visits and hidden moments. "It smells like him," Michael said quietly. And I realized he was right. Even after all these months, the house still carried traces of David's presence in the coffee he'd preferred, the aftershave that lingered on his clothes, the particular scent of the old books he'd collected in his study. Maria hung back near the door, giving Michael space to process his first experience in David's home. Over the months since we'd met, she and I had developed a complicated friendship built on our shared experience of loving a man who'd been unable to love us completely honestly. We'd had difficult conversations about David's choices, about the ways his compartmentalization had affected all of us. But we'd also found comfort in sharing memories with someone who understood the unique pain of his betrayal. "The living room is where he used to read his mystery novels," I told Michael, guiding him through the house that had been his father's sanctuary. He had this old leather chair that he claimed was the only comfortable seat in the house, even though Emma and I could never figure out what made it special. Michael approached David's reading chair with something approaching reverence, running his hand along the worn armrest where David's hand had rested during countless evenings of reading. "He told me about this chair," Michael said. He said, "It was where he did his best thinking, where he solved problems both personal and professional." "He never told us he'd described the house to you," Emma observed, settling onto the couch where she'd spent years doing homework while David read nearby. "He talked about this place all the time," Michael replied. "He described your mom's garden, the way the morning light came through the kitchen windows, the sound the old floorboards made when you walked across them at night. I felt like I knew this house before I ever saw it. The revelation that David had shared such intimate details of our daily life with Michael was still difficult for me to process. It suggested a level of emotional involvement in both families that went far beyond simple financial obligation. David hadn't just been supporting Michael from a distance. He'd been actively imagining what it would be like to bring his two worlds together. "Would you like to see his study?" I asked, leading Michael toward the room that had been David's most private space. The study had been left largely untouched since David's death, with his accounting books still organized on the shelves and his desk still arranged the way he'd preferred it. But now, it also contained the evidence of his secret life that I'd discovered in the months since finding his initial letter. I'd uncovered more hidden documents, more photographs, more proof of the elaborate system he'd developed to maintain relationships with both families, without either knowing about the other. Michael stopped in the doorway of the study, overwhelmed by the sight of David's professional sanctuary. The walls were lined with David's certificates and awards from his accounting firm, evidence of a successful career that had provided financial stability for both families. But tucked between the professional achievements were small personal touches that told a different story. A photo of Emma at her college graduation, a drawing that looked like Michael's childhood artwork, a small cactus that I'd given David for his birthday years ago. "He kept my drawing," Michael said, pointing to a crayon sketch that was matted and framed among David's professional accolades. "I made that for him when I was 8. It's supposed to be us hiking on Mount Hood." Emma moved closer to study the drawing, seeing her brother's childhood interpretation of time spent with their father. The image showed 2 stick figures on a mountainside, one tall and one small, with Dad and Michael written in careful block letters across the bottom. It was the kind of artwork any father would treasure, but David had displayed it in his professional space where he could see it every day while working. "He has one of my school photos in his desk drawer," Emma said, opening the middle drawer to show Michael a 5th grade class picture that David had apparently kept for years. "I never knew he'd saved it." We spent the next hour going through David's desk together, uncovering layers of his secret emotional life that none of us had fully understood. There were birthday cards from Michael dating back 15 years, all carefully preserved in a manila folder labeled "Important Documents." There were copies of Emma's report cards from elementary school, along with teacher comments about her academic progress and social development. There were photographs of Maria at various stages of her life, including one from what appeared to be her college graduation. "Look at this," Maria said, pulling a small notebook from the back of David's top drawer. The pages were filled with David's handwriting, but instead of accounting figures or business notes, it contained what appeared to be a running record of important moments in both families' lives. "Emma's first day of high school, September 3rd, Maria read aloud. "Michael's acceptance to Oregon State, March 15th. Sarah's promotion to lead teacher, April 22nd. Michael's first apartment, August 10th. The notebook revealed that David had been carefully tracking milestones and achievements in both families, creating his own private record of the lives he was simultaneously part of and separate from. Each entry was brief but detailed enough to suggest he'd been genuinely invested in our daily experiences, not just maintaining obligatory contact. "He was keeping score," Emma said, understanding the implications immediately. "Making sure he didn't miss anything important in either family, but also making sure he didn't accidentally mention something to the wrong family," I added, recognizing David's systematic approach to managing his deception. Michael closed the notebook and set it carefully on David's desk, his expression thoughtful. I used to wonder if Dad really cared about my life, or if he was just going through the motions because he felt guilty. But seeing this, seeing how he documented everything, I think he genuinely wanted to be part of both families. He just didn't know how to make that work, honestly. That afternoon, we drove to Cedar Falls Cemetery so Michael could visit David's grave for the second time. The first visit, 3 months earlier, had been emotional and cathartic, but this time felt different. Michael approached the headstone with more confidence, carrying a small potted plant that he wanted to place next to the flowers Emma and I maintained there. "I brought you something, Dad," Michael said, kneeling to plant the small succulent in the soft earth beside the granite marker. "It's a type of cactus that survives in difficult conditions. Mom said you always liked plants that could adapt to challenging environments." Emma knelt beside her brother, adding fresh daffodils to the small garden we'd created around David's grave. "We've been taking care of your garden at home too," she told the headstone. "Mom finally figured out how to keep your tomatoes alive." I watched David's 2 children working together to beautify his final resting place, and I felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. David's death had robbed us of the chance to hear his explanations, to understand his motivations directly, but it had also forced us to create relationships with each other that might never have existed if he'd remained alive to manage our separation. "I have something to tell you both," I said, sitting on the small bench that had been installed near David's grave. "I've been thinking about David's intentions, about what he was planning before he died." Michael and Emma joined me on the bench, both of them sensing that I had something important to share. "I found something else in David's papers last week," I continued. "A draft of a letter addressed to all 3 of us together. It was never finished, but it gives us some insight into what he was thinking in his final weeks." I pulled the unfinished letter from my purse, the pages worn from repeated readings. He wrote, "My dearest family, I know that describing you collectively this way will come as a shock, but you are all my family, and the time has come for me to stop living as if love requires separation. Sarah, Emma, and Michael, you are the 3 people who matter most to me in this world, and my greatest regret is that I have prevented you from knowing each other." Emma leaned closer as I continued reading David's unfinished words. "I know that my choices have hurt all of you in different ways. Sarah, I have betrayed your trust by hiding such a fundamental part of my life. Emma, I have deprived you of a brother who would have enriched your childhood and your understanding of family. Michael, I have relegated you to the shadows of my life when you deserve to be acknowledged and celebrated openly." "He knew," Michael said softly. "He understood exactly what his choices had cost all of us." "The letter goes on," I said, finding the passage that had given me the most insight into David's state of mind. "I am writing this because I have finally found the courage to tell the truth, even though I know it will change everything. I would rather risk losing all of you by being honest than continue to keep you from each other through my cowardice. You all deserve better than the half-truths and compartmentalized love I have been offering." "When did he write this?" Emma asked. "About 3 weeks before he died. It was in his briefcase, along with notes about how he wanted to arrange a meeting between all of us. He'd been planning to tell me about Michael and Maria during our anniversary dinner, and then arrange for all of us to meet the following weekend." The timing was devastating. David had finally found the strength to end his decades-long deception, but he'd run out of time to execute his plan. Instead of getting to hear his explanation and participate in his careful reunion strategy, we'd been left to discover the truth accidentally and navigate the aftermath without his guidance. What would have happened if he'd lived long enough to tell us? Michael wondered aloud. "I don't know," I admitted. "I might have been angry at first, confused and hurt by 25 years of lies. But I think eventually I would have come to understand his position, especially once I met you and realized what a remarkable young man you are. And I think I would have been excited about having a brother," Emma added, "once I got over the shock of learning that Dad had been keeping such a huge secret." We sat in silence for several minutes, each of us imagining how different our lives might have been if David had found the courage to tell the truth sooner, or if he'd lived long enough to implement his reunion plan. But gradually, I realized that dwelling on alternative histories was less important than acknowledging what had actually happened and what we'd gained from it. "I need to tell you both something," I said, making a decision I'd been considering for weeks. I'm grateful that David's secret brought us together, but I'm also tired of letting his choices define our relationships. We're not just connected through him anymore. We're connected to each other. Michael nodded, understanding immediately what I was trying to express. You mean we're choosing to be family, not just accepting that we're related? Exactly. David gave us the foundation, but we're building something new on top of it. Emma stood up and walked to David's headstone, placing her hand on the sun-warmed granite. Dad, I forgive you for lying to us, she said clearly. But I also want you to know that we're not going to let your mistakes define us. We're going to be the family you were too scared to let us become. Michael joined Emma at the headstone, adding his own words of closure. I spent years being angry that you couldn't acknowledge me publicly, but I understand now that you were protecting all of us the only way you knew how. Thank you for making sure we eventually found each other, even if it wasn't the way you planned. I approached the grave last, carrying the weight of 25 years of marriage and all the complicated emotions that came with loving someone who deceived me so thoroughly. David, I'm still processing what our marriage meant in light of everything I've learned, I said. But I want you to know that Michael and Emma are extraordinary people, and I'm honored to know them. Your love for them doesn't diminish what we had together. It just makes it more complex. As we prepared to leave the cemetery, Michael asked a question that had been on my mind for weeks. What happens now? I mean, we've all forgiven Dad, and we've gotten to know each other. But where do we go from here? I think we keep building, Emma said immediately. I want you to be part of my life going forward, not just as Dad's son, but as my brother. I want to know about your work, your relationships, your plans for the future. And I want you to feel welcome in our home, I added. Not as a visitor or a guest, but as family. David may not have been able to bring his families together, but we can choose to stay together. Maria, who had been quietly observing our family dynamics throughout the day, spoke up for the first time in hours. I think David would be amazed by what you've all accomplished, she said. He loved each of you so much, but he was never able to imagine that you could love each other without his mediation. Over the following months, Michael became a regular presence in our lives in ways that felt natural rather than forced. He joined us for Emma's college graduation, where he cheered louder than anyone when her name was called. He helped me plant David's memorial garden, sharing stories about hiking with his father while we worked together in the soil. He and Emma developed inside jokes and sibling rivalry that reminded me of David's relationship with his own sister. But the most meaningful change was the way we all began to talk about David. Instead of the idealized version of him that Emma and I had preserved, or the compartmentalized version that Michael had known, we created a more complete picture that acknowledged both his strengths and his limitations. David became a man who'd loved deeply but imperfectly, who'd made significant mistakes while trying to do right by everyone he cared about. One evening in late summer, almost a year after I'd found David's original letter, the three of us were sitting on my back porch watching the sunset when Emma asked the question that had been implicit in all our conversations, but never directly addressed. Do you think Dad was a good man? She asked. Michael considered the question carefully before answering. I think he was a man who tried to be good, but got trapped by his own choices, he said. He could have walked away from me and Maria completely, but he didn't. He could have told you the truth and risked losing his marriage, but he was too scared. So he chose a middle path that hurt everyone a little bit instead of devastating someone completely. I think he was human, I said. Flawed and scared and ultimately loving, even when that love was expressed imperfectly. I think he was my dad, Emma said simply. Not perfect, not honest, but mine. And I'm glad his mistakes led us to each other. As autumn approached, marking the first anniversary of David's death, we planned a memorial service that would have been impossible. while he was alive. We invited David's colleagues, our friends, Maria's family, and Michael's friends to celebrate a life that had touched more people than any of us had realized. For the first time, everyone who had loved David was in the same room, sharing memories and stories that painted a fuller picture of who he'd been. Michael gave a speech about the father who'd taught him to appreciate nature and think critically about problems. Emma spoke about the dad who'd encouraged her academic curiosity and supported her environmental activism. I shared memories of the husband who'd been gentle with injured animals and patient with difficult people. But the most powerful moment came when Maria stood up to speak about David's character. "David Mitchell was not a perfect man," she said to the gathered crowd. "He made choices that hurt people he loved, and he carried secrets that were too heavy for anyone to bear alone. But he was also a man who took responsibility for his actions, who provided for his children even when it was difficult, and who never stopped trying to find a way to do right by everyone in his life." After the service, as people shared their own memories of David, I realized that his secret life had actually revealed something beautiful about his character. He hadn't been living a double life because he was selfish or deceptive by nature. He'd been trying to honor commitments to people he loved, even when those commitments seemed mutually exclusive. That night, after everyone had gone home, Michael, Emma, and I sat in David's study, surrounded by the evidence of his complicated life. The room no longer felt like a shrine to deception. It felt like a testament to love that had been too large for the conventional boundaries David had tried to impose on it. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Emma said, holding the photograph of Michael as a child that David had kept on his desk. "Not just forgiving Dad, but forgiving ourselves for the assumptions we made about each other." "What do you mean?" Michael asked. "I mean, I spent months being angry that Dad had another family, feeling like your existence somehow diminished my relationship with him. But that was never true. Dad's love for you didn't take anything away from his love for me," Michael nodded. "And I spent years feeling like I wasn't good enough to be acknowledged by my father, like there was something wrong with me that made me have to be kept secret. But it wasn't about my worth. It was about his fear. And I spent 25 years believing I knew my husband completely," I added. "When I found out about you, Michael, I felt like my entire marriage had been a lie. But loving you and Maria didn't make David's love for Emma and me false. It just made him more complicated than I'd understood." We decided that night to create something David had never been able to build, a family that was honest about its complexity. We acknowledged that our relationships had been born from deception, but we chose to build them on truth going forward. We agreed to share difficult emotions, to ask hard questions, to resist the temptation to idealize or demonize David's memory. 2 years later, I moved out of the house that David and I had shared, not because I wanted to escape his memory, but because I was ready to create new memories that included all the people I'd come to love. I bought a smaller place closer to Portland, where Michael and Emma could visit more easily, and where Maria and I could continue building our unlikely friendship. The Victorian house in Cedar Falls was sold to a young family with small children, who would fill it with different kinds of love and different kinds of secrets. But before I left, I took one last walk through David's study, remembering the morning I'd found his letter and discovered that love could be both larger and more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Standing in that empty room, I realized that David's greatest gift to us hadn't been his honesty, which he'd never quite managed to achieve. It had been his love, which was deep enough to survive the discovery of his deception and strong enough to create bonds between people who might never have met otherwise. His secret had ended, but the family it revealed was just beginning, and that was a legacy worth building on, one honest conversation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.